I was standing on my own land when an HOA woman marched up with paperwork in hand, loudly announcing that I owed a $3 million fine for violations she couldn't even clearly explain, ignoring neighbors who told her she was wrong, smirking as phones came out because she thought intimidation would force me to pay, completely confident that she had power over me, not realizing that the land she was threatening me on was legally mine, that her HOA had no authority there at all, and that by the time I calmly called her bluff, the paperwork I pulled out would end with the entire HOA being evicted from my property. So before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you were watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. I was standing on my own land that afternoon, the kind of quiet afternoon where nothing feels urgent and the air carries the calm confidence of ownership, when a woman I had never met before marched toward me with a rigid posture and a stack of papers clutched tightly in her hands, her heels striking the gravel as if every step was meant to announce authority she had already decided she possessed. And before I could even greet her, she launched into a rehearsed speech about violations, penalties, and fines, loudly declaring that I owed the Homeowners Association $3 million for what she described as long-standing non-compliance, a number so absurd it made several nearby neighbors stop what they were doing and turn to watch. She spoke quickly and forcefully, barely pausing to breathe, as if momentum alone would make her words true, pointing repeatedly at the land beneath our feet and gesturing broadly to the surrounding property, insisting that every square inch fell under HOA control, that I had ignored notices, deadlines, and warnings, and that today was the final step before legal enforcement, all while ignoring the fact that I had never received a single legitimate notice and had never agreed to any HOA authority in the first place. Neighbors began to gather at a cautious distance, some shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones, because even to an outsider the situation felt off, and a few people tried to step in to tell her she was mistaken, calmly explaining that this property had a separate history, separate records, and separate ownership that predated the HOA entirely, but she cut them off mid-sentence, dismissing them with a wave of her hand and a sharp remark about how opinions don't matter when rules are broken. She smiled when she noticed people recording, the kind of tight, satisfied smile that comes from believing you are about to publicly win, and she repeated the $3 million figure louder, as if volume could transform a threat into a fact, warning me that refusal to comply would result in liens, seizures, and forced removal, all delivered with a confidence that suggested she had never once been challenged in her role before. I listened without interrupting, not because I was intimidated, but because I had learned long ago that people who rely on bluster often reveal everything you need to know if you simply let them talk long enough. And as she continued, it became clear that she was operating entirely on assumption that I was unaware, assumption that I was powerless, assumption that her title alone made her untouchable. When she finally paused and demanded an answer, I calmly asked a single question about jurisdiction, specifically requesting that she identify the recorded deed that placed this land under HOA authority. And the moment I asked it, her expression flickered just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for someone who understood legal posturing to recognize uncertainty trying to hide behind confidence. Instead of answering, she doubled down, stating that the HOA's internal documents were sufficient, that challenging them would only increase penalties, and that she strongly advised me to cooperate before matters escalated further. But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly have known in that moment, was that the escalation she threatened was already documented, already anticipated, and already resolved on paper long before she ever stepped foot onto my property. I reached into my truck and retrieved a weathered but meticulously organized folder, one that contained certified records, historical deeds, survey maps, and legal determinations that traced ownership back decades before the HOA ever existed. And as I opened it and calmly laid the documents out on the hood, the atmosphere around us changed, the way it always does when loud confidence meets quiet certainty. Her voice softened just a fraction as she scanned the first page, then hardened again as she insisted the documents were irrelevant. But by then the neighbors had leaned closer, phones were recording steadily, and the energy of the moment had shifted away from her performance and toward the truth unfolding in front of everyone. I explained, slowly and clearly, that the land she claimed authority over was never transferred, annexed, or subjected to HOA governance, that the HOA's developments had encroached onto my property over time without proper authorization, and that the fines she demanded had no legal standing whatsoever. Facts supported not by opinion, but by recorded law. For the first time since she arrived, she stopped interrupting. The color drained from her face as realization crept in, because what she had assumed was a simple shakedown had just transformed into a documented exposure of overreach, and the very paperwork she relied on to intimidate residents was about to be used against the organization she represented. I told her, calmly and without raising my voice, that by asserting control where none existed, the HOA had placed itself in legal jeopardy, and that the structures, claims, and enforcement actions on my land were not only invalid but subject to removal. A statement that landed heavily in the sudden silence that followed. That was the moment she understood that the $3 million demand she arrived with was nothing more than a bluff, and that I had no intention of paying it, because the truth was far more damaging to her position than she could have imagined when she walked up so confidently. And before I explain exactly how the HOA reacted when the full legal consequences became clear, and how this confrontation ended with the entire association being forced off my property, tell me where you're watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. The woman did not retreat after her initial demand failed to intimidate me, because people who rely on authority they do not actually possess rarely recognize the moment they have lost control. And instead of reassessing the situation, she straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and began speaking again with even more force, as though confidence alone could overwrite reality. She explained that she represented the Homeowners Association, a phrase she repeated several times as if it were a magic key that unlocked obedience. And she spoke about bylaws, covenants, compliance committees, and enforcement powers in a rehearsed rhythm that suggested she had delivered this same speech many times before to people who lacked the resources, knowledge, or patience to challenge her claims. Every sentence carried an assumption that her words were final, that her interpretation of the rules was unquestionable, and that anyone standing in front of her existed in a position of lesser authority by default, which is the quiet danger of unchecked power when it goes too long without resistance. She referenced sections of documents without producing them, cited penalties without explaining their basis, and spoke about board decisions as though they were equal to law, all while avoiding any mention of recorded property boundaries, county filings, or historical ownership, because false authority thrives on abstraction and collapses under specificity. When neighbors asked how a fine of that magnitude could be imposed without prior notice, she dismissed the question by saying notices had been sent, though she could not specify when, where, or to whom. And when another neighbor mentioned that the land in question predated the development itself, she waved it off as irrelevant history, proving she had no interest in truth beyond what supported her narrative. Her tone sharpened as question continued, because false authority is fragile, and every request for clarification felt to her like defiance. And instead of answering, she began issuing warnings, claiming that refusal to comply would trigger escalating consequences, including liens, legal actions, and forced removal, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed fear would succeed where facts had failed. What she did not understand was that authority is not declared, it is proven. And while she spoke, every inconsistency weakened her position. Because real authority welcomes verification while false authority fears it. I noticed the way her language shifted whenever specifics were requested. How she leaned heavily on vague phrases like "as per HOA policy" and "under board discretion," avoiding direct references to any governing body that actually held jurisdiction over the land, which revealed that her power existed only within a narrow bubble that collapsed the moment it encountered property law. She accused me of obstruction when I asked for clarification, claimed I was being difficult when I requested documentation, and framed basic questions as hostile behavior, a tactic often used by those who mistake compliance for respect and resistance for wrongdoing. As more neighbors gathered, the dynamic shifted further, because authority that depends on isolation struggles under scrutiny, and her performance began to look less like enforcement and more like intimidation, especially as witnesses recognized the gaps between her claims and the reality of the land they had lived beside for years. Phones continued recording, not out of excitement but out of disbelief, because it was becoming clear that this was not a misunderstanding but an attempted assertion of control where none legally existed. And the woman's refusal to acknowledge that possibility made the situation increasingly uncomfortable. To watch, she attempted to regain dominance by issuing a final warning, stating that this was my last chance to comply before the HOA took action, but the threat rang hollow, because she had already failed to establish the foundation that would make such action legitimate. What she believed was authority was actually habit, reinforced by past encounters where residents complied without question, and that habit had calcified into arrogance, leaving her unprepared for someone who understood both their rights and the law. I calmly explained that authority without jurisdiction is meaningless, that no association can impose fines, seize property, or demand compliance beyond its legal boundaries, and that repeating a claim does not transform it into fact. A statement that visibly unsettled her because it stripped her position down to its core weakness. For the first time, she glanced around, not at me, but at the neighbors, the recording phones, and the unfolding awareness that her authority was not being accepted as unquestionable truth. And in that moment, her posture shifted from dominance to defensiveness. She accused me of undermining the community, of threatening order, of refusing to cooperate, framing herself as the guardian of structure while painting me as the problem, a reversal that only works when the audience lacks context, which was no longer the case. The irony was unmistakable, because the very people she claimed to represent were watching her overreach in real time, realizing that compliance had been mistaken for consent, and that silence had been interpreted as agreement for far too long. As the conversation stalled, it became clear that her authority had reached its limit, not because I raised my voice or escalated the situation, but because false authority cannot survive sustained scrutiny. And every moment she remained without proof weakened her stand. Ding further. She gathered her papers tighter, as if holding onto them physically might restore the power they no longer carried, and she announced that the HOA would take this further. A vague promise that revealed more desperation than control, because escalation without foundation only magnifies exposure. That was when I understood that the confrontation was no longer about a fine or a rule, but about the collapse of an illusion. The illusion that authority exists simply because someone says it does, and the realization that once that illusion cracks, it can never be fully repaired. And as she stepped back, visibly unsettled, it was clear that the next phase would not be decided by intimidation or volume, but by records, law, and consequences, all of which were already set in motion. The moment authority begins to crumble, paperwork becomes everything, because paper does not raise its voice, does not posture, and does not intimidate. But it remembers precisely what people hope has been forgotten. And that afternoon, the truth lived quietly inside documents that had existed long before the HOA ever imagined itself in control. I did not rush when I began laying the documents out, because urgency benefits those who want to confuse the facts, and instead I moved carefully, page by page, explaining what each record represented, not to convince the woman standing in front of me, but to establish clarity for everyone watching, because once the truth is public, it cannot be easily buried again. The first document was the original deed, recorded decades before the neighborhood development even broke ground, clearly defining the property boundaries with measurements, markers, and survey references that left no room for interpretation. And as I traced those lines with my finger, it became obvious to anyone paying attention that the land the HOA claimed authority over had never been legally transferred, annexed, or included under its jurisdiction. Next came the survey maps, professionally conducted and county certified, showing the precise relationship between my land and the surrounding properties, revealing that, while the HOA development bordered my property, it did not own it, control it, or possess any legal claim to it, a distinction that had apparently been ignored or deliberately overlooked for years. As the pages turned, the crowd grew quieter, because paperwork carries a different kind of weight than argument, and every document reinforced the same conclusion, that the HOA's authority ended at a boundary line it had repeatedly crossed without permission. The woman attempted to interrupt, insisting that HOA bylaws superseded older records, but that AIM collapsed instantly under the reality that bylaws do not override property law, and no internal rulebook can erase a recorded deed no matter how confidently it is cited. I explained that property rights are established through public record, not association vote, and that any enforcement action taken without jurisdiction is not authority but trespass, a word that visibly unsettled her as it reframed the entire situation from compliance to liability. More documents followed, including correspondence from years prior that demonstrated my repeated refusal to join the HOA, letters that had been acknowledged and filed proving that the association was fully aware it lacked authority over my land, despite its later claims to the contrary. At that point, the narrative the woman arrived with began to collapse completely, because this was no longer a misunderstanding, but a documented pattern of overreach, and the realization set in that the HOA had not simply been mistaken, but negligent, if not deliberately deceptive. Neighbors leaned in closer, recognizing familiar names, dates, and references, connecting pieces they had never been shown before, and the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to concern, because if the HOA had misrepresented authority here, it raised uncomfortable questions about where else it might have done the same. The woman's posture changed again as she realized the paper trail did not just contradict her claims, but expose them, and her voice lost its earlier sharpness as she attempted to regain control by questioning the relevance of older records, a tactic that failed because property law does not expire with convenience. I calmly explained that land remembers even when people do not, and that records exist precisely to prevent the kind of revisionism she was attempting, a statement that resonated deeply with those watching, because it reframed the conflict as one between permanence and performance. She accused me of selectively presenting information, but the accusation rang hollow because every document I presented was publicly accessible, verifiable, and stamped with official record numbers, meaning anyone could confirm the truth independently. The most damaging document came last, not because it was dramatic, but because it was definitive, a legal opinion issued years earlier that explicitly warned the HOA against asserting authority over my property. A warning that had been acknowledged and then ignored, transforming the situation from accidental overreach into willful misconduct. When that page was revealed, the energy shifted entirely because the consequences of ignoring such a warning extended far beyond embarrassment and into the realm of liability, restitution, and potential dissolution of authority claims. The woman went silent for a long moment, scanning the page as though hoping it might somehow read differently if she stared long enough. But facts do not bend under pressure, and the realization settled in that the HOA's position was not just weak, but indefensible. Neighbors exchanged glances, some angry, some stunned, because many had paid fines, altered their properties, or complied with demands that now appeared legally questionable, and the scope of the issue expanded far beyond the original confrontation. I made it clear that this was not personal but legal, and that authority must be exercised responsibly or not at all, a statement that shifted the focus from blame to accountability and left no room for theatrics. The woman attempted one final assertion, claiming the matter would be reviewed internally, but the phrase sounded hollow because internal review holds no power over external law, and everyone present understood that the truth had already moved beyond her control as the documents were gathered back into the folder. The significance of the moment lingered, because once a paper trail is exposed, it cannot be unseen, and the illusion of authority collapses under the quiet weight of recorded truth. It was clear then that the next steps would not involve arguments on driveways or threats delivered with clipboards, but legal consequences unfolding through proper channels, consequences that would reshape not just one interaction, but the balance of power that had gone unquestioned for far too long. And as the woman stepped back, no longer issuing demands but avoiding eye contact, the realization settled in that this confrontation was only the beginning, because paper does not forget, and neither does the law once it has been properly invoked. The moment the documents were gathered back into the folder, something irreversible had already happened, because the confrontation was no longer driven by volume, posture, or intimidation, but by facts that could not be argued away, and the woman standing in front of me understood that instinctively, even if she was not yet ready to admit it aloud. For several seconds, she said nothing, and that silence spoke louder than any of her earlier threats, because it revealed the truth she had been trying to outrun, that the power she believed she carried into this situation had never actually existed, and that every demand she made rested on an assumption that had just been publicly dismantled. When she finally spoke again, her tone was noticeably different, stripped of the sharp certainty that had defined her arrival, replaced instead with a cautious defensiveness, as she claimed that the documents would need to be reviewed by the board, a phrase often used when someone realizes they are standing on unstable ground and needs time to retreat. But the bluff had already been called, and everyone present understood. It, because a bluff only works when the other side doubts their own position, and there was no doubt left to exploit. Not for me, and not for the neighbors who had just watched her authority unravel page by page. She attempted to reframe the situation, suggesting that this had all been a misunderstanding, that no harm was intended, and that perhaps the fine could be reassessed. But those words rang hollow, because reassessment implies discretion, and discretion only exists when authority is real, which hers was not. What had started as a demand for compliance had turned into an attempt at damage control, and the shift was unmistakable, because she was no longer issuing orders, but searching for exits, scanning faces, gauging reactions, and realizing that the crowd she had expected to intimidate was now quietly judging her actions. One neighbor asked a simple question about whether the HOA had the right to impose fines at all under these circumstances, and instead of answering directly, she deflected, claiming that legal counsel would need to clarify, a response that further confirmed what everyone already knew, that she no longer had answers, only delays. I explained calmly that the issue was not open to interpretation, because jurisdiction is not flexible, and once it is proven to be absent, every action taken under its false assumption becomes invalid, a statement that left no room for negotiation or compromise. The woman attempted one last show of resolve by stating that the HOA would pursue legal remedies, but the threat carried no weight because pursuing legal action would require scrutiny, and scrutiny would expose everything the documents had already revealed, including prior warnings, ignored boundaries, and unauthorized claims. At that point, the bluff fully collapsed, because escalation was no longer a weapon but a liability, and she knew it, because more this situation moved into formal channels, the more dangerous it became for the organization she represented. Her body language betrayed her, shoulders tightening, grip on her papers loosening, eyes no longer meeting mine, because confidence born of authority can survive challenge, but confidence born of assumption cannot survive proof. The neighbors sensed it too, the subtle but decisive moment when power shifted, completely, not through confrontation, but through clarity, and the energy of the gathering changed from tension to quiet resolve, as people recognized that what they were witnessing was not a dispute but an exposure. Someone asked whether past fines might be affected by this revelation, and the question landed heavily, because it expanded the scope of the issue beyond this single property, forcing the realization that the HOA's actions might have impacted dozens of people under the same false premise. The woman tried to shut that line of questioning down, insisting that this discussion was not the appropriate forum. But the attempt failed, because once authority is questioned publicly, it cannot be recontained, and the crowd had already begun connecting the dots. I made it clear that I had no intention of escalating the situation theatrically, but that I would not ignore documented overreach, especially when it involved property rights, because silence in the face of misconduct is how abuse of power survives unchecked. That statement marked the end of her leverage, because she could no longer position herself as the enforcer of order, only as the representative of an organization facing consequences for actions it had no right to take. She stepped back physically then, increasing the distance between us, a subtle but telling move that symbolized her retreat from the authority she had tried to assert, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked uncertain about what to do next. The bluff had not failed loudly, with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but quietly, through exposure, and that made it far more devastating because there was no spectacle to distract from the truth. Phones continued recording, not out of excitement but out of awareness, because moments like this matter, and people recognize when they are watching a turning point rather than a performance. Finally, she announced that she would be leaving, and that the HOA would follow up, but the words lacked conviction, because follow-up implies control, and control had slipped beyond her reach the moment the paper trail surfaced. As she walked away, the significance of what had just occurred settled over the group, because intimidation had been met with documentation, threats had been met with law, and a bluff that relied on silence had been dismantled in the open. It was clear then that the HOA's strategy had failed not just here, but fundamentally, because once a bluff is exposed, it cannot be reused, and the organization would now be forced to confront the consequences of years spent assuming compliance meant consent. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, the understanding remained that this was no longer about one confrontation, but about accountability finally catching up to unchecked authority, setting the stage for what would come next. Once the bluff collapsed and the immediate confrontation ended, the situation moved out of the realm of performance and into the domain where outcomes are no longer shaped by confidence or intimidation, but by records, statutes, and consequences that do not care who speaks the loudest, because legal reality does not negotiate with ego. Within days, formal letters began to circulate, not just to me, but to the HOA board, their retained counsel, and the county offices that oversaw property records. And unlike the informal threats delivered on my driveway, these communications were precise, restrained, and unmistakably serious in tone. The language was deliberate, outlining jurisdictional limits, citing recorded deeds, referencing survey data, and documenting prior warnings that had been acknowledged and ignored. all of which established a clear timeline showing that the HOA had acted despite knowing it lacked authority, a distinction that transformed error into liability. Legal reality arrived quietly, without spectacle, but its impact was immediate, because the HOA's attorneys now had to reconcile what their client claimed with what the public record actually showed, and those two narratives could no longer coexist. Internal meetings were held behind closed doors, emergency sessions convened, and legal counsel asked questions that should have been asked years earlier, questions about boundaries, governance, enforcement authority, and exposure, because once liability becomes visible, denial is no longer an option. What became clear why quickly was that the HOA was not dealing with a single isolated incident, but with a systemic problem, because authority asserted without jurisdiction does not simply affect one person. It creates a chain reaction of invalid actions, unenforceable penalties, and potential restitution. The fines they had imposed, the demands they had issued, and the compliance they had extracted all came under scrutiny, because legal reality does not stop at the first visible crack. It follows the fault line wherever it leads. Attorneys reviewed enforcement records, cross-referenced them against property boundaries, and discovered inconsistencies that could no longer be dismissed as clerical errors, revealing a pattern of overreach that extended well beyond my land. The HOA's tone changed in its communications almost overnight, shifting from declarative to cautious, from threatening to conciliatory, because legal reality strips away bravado and replaces it with risk assessment. And the risk was no longer theoretical. They stopped issuing demands and began requesting discussions, stopped referencing penalties and began using words like resolution and clarification. A linguistic shift that signaled their recognition that they were no longer in control of the narrative. What they were facing was not just a challenge to authority, but a question of legitimacy, because an organization that enforces rules without jurisdiction undermines its own foundation. And once that foundation is questioned, everything built on it becomes unstable. County officials reviewed the filings and confirmed what the documents had already shown, that the land in question was never subject to HOA governance, and that any enforcement actions taken there were void, a conclusion that carried significant implications for liability. That confirmation changed the stakes entirely, because it meant the issue was no longer a private dispute, but a matter of public record, and public record does not disappear simply because it becomes inconvenient. The HOA's legal counsel advised restraint, because further enforcement could compound the problem, and silence replaced aggression as they recalibrated their position, realizing that every move forward now carried the potential for further exposure. Neighbors began asking questions, not confrontational ones but careful ones, about whether past fines were valid, whether modifications had been forced unnecessarily, and whether compliance had been demanded under false authority, questions that could no longer be dismissed as hypothetical. The legal reality was that once jurisdiction was disproven in one documented instance, it opened the door for scrutiny across the board, and the HOA could no longer rely on the assumption that its authority would go unchallenged. Meetings grew tense as board members confronted the possibility that years of enforcement actions might not withstand legal review, and that restitution, corrective measures, or dissolution of authority in certain areas could follow. What made the situation particularly difficult for them was that none of this required dramatic action on my part, because legal reality advances through process, not confrontation, and once initiated, it continues forward regardless of personal feelings. I made it clear that my goal was not chaos but correction, because authority must align with law to be legitimate, and compliance extracted under false premises damages trust, not just between residents and boards, but within communities themselves. That distinction mattered, because legal reality does not demand punishment, it demands alignment, and the HOA now faced the task of either realigning its operations with the law or accepting the consequences of failing to do so. The illusion of control they had relied on for years had been replaced by oversight, documentation, and accountability, forces that do not respond to pressure or persuasion. As legal counsel worked through the implications, it became evident that the HOA's presence on my land was untenable, because occupation without authority is not governance, it is encroachment, and encroachment carries remedies. The conversation shifted away from whether the HOA was right and toward how much damage had already been done, and how that damage could be addressed without further escalation. Legal reality does not offer easy exits, but it does offer clarity, and the clarity here was that the HOA had overstepped, been warned, ignored those warnings, and now had to face the consequences of those decisions. By the time the next steps were outlined, it was clear that this chapter was no longer about asserting rights, but about restoring boundaries, correcting records, and undoing years of assumed authority that had never been earned. The legal system does not care about pride, reputation, or narrative. It cares about jurisdiction, record, and law, and once those elements align, outcomes become inevitable. And as the HOA prepared to confront those outcomes, the final truth settled in, that legal reality had arrived not as a sudden strike, but as a steady force, and it would not leave until the imbalance it revealed had been resolved. Consequences rarely arrive with drama, because real consequences do not need spectacle to be effective, and when they finally took shape, they did so methodically, unfolding through notices, filings, and actions that carried the full weight of law rather than the hollow authority the HOA had relied on for years. The first consequence was structural, not symbolic, because once jurisdiction was formally clarified, the HOA was required to cease all enforcement activity related to my property immediately, including fines, notices, and any claims of governance, a directive that stripped them of the control they had assumed without question. That alone would have been significant, but it was only the beginning because authority asserted without legal foundation leaves behind damage, and damage creates responsibility, whether or not the responsible party is prepared to accept it. Surveyors were dispatched not as a courtesy, but as a requirement to re-establish boundaries that had been ignored or blurred through years of assumption, and those boundaries did not move to accommodate convenience or narrative, because land does not care who believes they control it. The results confirmed what the records had already shown, that portions of the HOA's claimed territory existed entirely outside its legal reach, meaning structures, signage, and enforcement zones had been placed where they never belonged. And once that reality was documented, corrective action became unavoidable. Formal notices followed, instructing the HOA to remove any physical indicators of authority from my land, including signs, barriers, and administrative claims, a process that transformed abstract accountability into visible consequence. Neighbors watched quietly as those markers were taken down, not with celebration but with recognition. Because the removal symbolized more than a territorial correction, it represented the collapse of an assumption that had governed behavior for years without challenge. Financial consequences followed next, not as punishment, but as remedy, because fines imposed without authority are not merely invalid, they are subject to restitution, and that reality forced the HOA to confront records it had never expected to review so closely. Payments were examined, timelines reconstructed, and compliance actions reevaluated, revealing that the impact of overreach extended beyond inconvenience and into real financial harm for individuals who had trusted the HOA's claims. The board faced decisions it could no longer postpone, because denial had ceased to be an option, and accountability had replaced ambiguity, and every choice now carried measurable consequence rather than rhetorical cover. Some board members resigned quietly, not because they admitted wrongdoing publicly, but because leadership under scrutiny demands more than confidence, it demands responsibility. And not everyone is prepared to meet that standard when it finally arrives. Others stayed, attempting to navigate the transition from unchecked authority to lawful governance, a process that required humility, transparency, and a willingness to admit that compliance does not equal consent. Policies were rewritten, boundaries clarified, and enforcement protocols revised, not out of generosity, but out of necessity, because the cost of repeating the same mistakes had become too high to ignore. The HOA's presence changed noticeably after that, quieter, more cautious, and far less absolute, because once authority is challenged successfully, it cannot be wielded casually again. For the neighbors, the consequences were both immediate and lasting, because they had witnessed the transformation of power through knowledge, and that awareness altered how rules were questioned, how notices were received, and how authority was evaluated. Questions replaced assumptions, verification replaced fear, and silence no longer served as consent, because people had seen what happens when someone finally says no and backs it with fact. For me, the outcome was not about victory, because consequences are not trophies. They are corrections, and the correction here was the restoration of boundaries that should never have been crossed in the first place. The land remained what it had always been, independent, documented, and governed by law rather than association decree. And that stability mattered more than any momentary satisfaction. What lingered most was not the removal of signs or the rewriting of policies, but the shift in understanding, because authority that operates without challenge eventually forgets its limits, and only accountability reminds it where those limits exist. The HOA learned that rules do not create power unless they are grounded in jurisdiction, that fines do not create compliance unless they are lawful, and that intimidation collapses instantly when confronted with clarity. The neighbors learned that asking questions is not defiance, that documentation matters, and that silence benefits only those who misuse authority. And the situation ended not with raised voices or dramatic exits, but with restored balance, because the most lasting consequences are the ones that quietly realign systems back to where they were always supposed to be. In the end, the entire ordeal proved a simple truth that had been obscured for too long: that authority must answer to law, that power must accept limits, and that when those principles are enforced, even the most confident overreach eventually gives way to accountability. And that is how the HOA lost control of land it never owned, authority it never had, and credibility it could not recover once the truth was fully revealed.